So last week we finished chapter 21. It's an important chapter because that's where Paul gets arrested. Actually, he gets saved by the Romans when the Jews saw him in the temple grounds and wanted to kill him. He had come to Jerusalem and he had brought them a gift of money, because there were a lot of poor people in Jerusalem and there was a famine. And then the brethren in Jerusalem said, you know, there are thousands of faithful people who still adhere to the law. What's to be done? How can we show that you're still a Jew and people won't attack you and kill you? And so they said, well, here's 4 men taking a vow, and you've taken a vow. Take them to the temple and purify yourself and pay for their sacrifice, and then you can have your hair cut, and then your vow will be up. So Paul does that. He goes to the temple, he purifies himself along with the 4 others, he pays for their sacrifices, and then the story ends. The story ends because some men from Asia, from Ephesus and Antioch and Iconium and Lystra, places that Paul had trouble with on his missionary journeys, they see him in the temple. And they said, there's that dirty dog right there. And they rush him. And they take him out of the temple. Well, while all this is going on and they're roughing him up, the commander of the Roman garrison there, Claudius Lysias, goes in and actually saves Paul. They would have killed him. Instead, Paul saves him, Claudius saves him, and he's interested as to why are these people so upset with him? What has he done? And that's where chapter 21 ends. What has he done? And Paul has asked permission to speak to this crowd. And so that's where we begin in verse 1. He's standing on the stairs and he says, brothers and fathers. Oh, yeah. 22. Brethren and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer to you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they became even more quiet. Now, just before at the end of chapter 21, Claudius Lysias asked Paul, can you speak Greek? Yeah, I can speak Greek, and I'm going to speak Hebrew too, and you're not going to understand it. And he did that, I think, on purpose, just to show that he's not dealing with the village idiot. Paul was a very intelligent guy. And I think it's interesting that he says, brothers and fathers, hear my defense. This is almost the same exact verbiage that Stephen used. And in being this gentle and this kind, he got their ear. If he just said, listen up, meatheads, he would have turned them off before they heard a word he said. This way, he has their attention, just like Stephen had their attention. And then he addressed them in the Hebrew dialect, which is a dialect that the more educated used. It's called, I'll tell you what it's called. It's called Sino-Chaldaic, just a Hebrew language that intellectuals used. And he says, listen to me. What he's going to do is he's going to set these guys up and tell them about his former life. And what did he do in his former life? He persecuted the church. And then he's going to bring them around to say, now this is what I'm doing now. And there was a little something happened to me on the road to Damascus. So he says, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia. This was a Roman colony. It was a free city. He was born a Roman citizen, as was his family. And he says, I was brought up in this city. So his parents must have sent him to the school of Gamaliel when he was young. The way I'd put it is he went to kindergarten, grade school, junior high, and high school, and college, all at the same place. And he says, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you are today. I think he was brought up as a Pharisee. But I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women into prison, as also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. Interesting that he could cross one nation's line and take people prisoner. He said, I persecuted the way to death. He killed people or had ordered people to be killed. And he was putting both men and women in prisons. And also the high priest and the council of the elders can testify. Now we're 25 years later since he had done these things, and some of these people were still alive. Caiaphas might have been alive, and some of the people who were members of the Sanhedrin may have been alive, and you can go check it out with them. So they knew that at one point in his life he was more zealous than anybody else to rid the world of Christianity, and the people that make it up. And from this council, from the Sanhedrin, he received letters to the brethren, to the people up in Damascus, and to the synagogues up there. And I started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. He was going to bring these people back, and they were going to throw them in jail. They were going to punish them. Some they would kill. Not a nice guy. But here's what happened to me. Something happened to me to make me change my ways. Wasn't very dramatic, was it? But as it happened that I was on my way, approaching Damascus about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. Can you imagine how his heart must have fallen? So as he was going to Damascus, that's where Jesus intercepted him, probably just a mile or so from Damascus. And the light that shined around him was so great, it blinded him. So he couldn't see, but he heard a voice. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Did Saul persecute Jesus in the flesh? Everybody go like this. No. He persecuted his church, which is his body. And now he's going to meet the man face to face and have him give an answer for himself. As one guy said in a fight, he says, this is going to be me and you, but it's going to be mostly me. It was mostly Jesus doing the talking and Saul listening. So why are you persecuting me? Why are you treating my people in an ill-mannered way? And I answered, who are you, Lord? This is a respectful request. And he said, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. Jesus was persecuting Christ's body, his church, and Jesus took umbrage to it. He said, I got to straighten this guy out. Now, Jesus knew that Paul or Saul was an incredibly intelligent man, and that he had an honest heart, although he was doing things that were not so great. And when did Jesus know that Paul would be the man that he would choose to send to the Gentiles and teach them the gospel? How about from his mother's womb? Before Paul was born, Jesus knew that he would use him to preach the gospel. Where are we? And those who were with me saw the light. Now, much of this is a repeat of chapter 9, when the first account of his going to Damascus. And those who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. So who were those who were with him? I thought he went by himself. No, he had temple guards to go with him. But they did not understand the one who was speaking to me. So they heard it, but they didn't understand it. And I said, "What shall I do, Lord?" Lord meaning master. And the Lord said to me, "Get up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that has been appointed for you to do." In chapter 9, he says, "Go to the street called Straight, and go to a man's house whose name is Judas. And he'll tell you, or you'll find out what to do when you get to his house." So the men who were with him took him by the hand like a little kid and trotted him off down to Damascus, and he's going, it must have been a sight. But since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and I came to Damascus. Can you imagine how he must have felt? I mean, here he was, off on his merry way, going to arrest this villainy, these Christians, and then a bright light shines. He's blinded. A voice speaks to him and says, "I'm Jesus, and you're persecuting me." Can you imagine the thoughts that must have run through his mind? And one of those would have said, "I think maybe I got this all wrong." And a certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the Jews and well spoken of by the Jews, in other words, a man who was religiously pious and had favor with the people, and well spoken of by the Jews who lived there, said, "And this Ananias came to me, and standing near me said to me, Brother Saul." Isn't it interesting that he mentioned him as brother? This is a man who was persecuting the church and killing Christians, and this guy calls him brother. "Receive your sight." And at that very time I looked up at him, and he said, "The God of our fathers, Yahweh, has appointed you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear an utterance from his mouth." Now, he'd already spoken to Christ on the road to Damascus. Now they're going to have another chat here in just a few verses. You're going to hear from Jesus. "For you will be a witness for him to all men of what you will be a witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. So why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name." You're going to be a witness to the things that you have seen and heard. Talking about his ordeal on the road to Damascus. People like to say, "Well, I want to witness to you." You can't witness anything. You weren't there, but Paul was. And he's going to tell people about what happened to him on the road to Damascus and how he met Jesus. And what's really interesting is that later on he says, "Yes, Christ chose me even from my mother's womb," which gives you some idea about the greatness of the mind of God, that he could pick someone out 30 years in advance that I'm going to use him. He's going to be my witness. And of course, he probably picked one of the most intelligent men, academically intelligent men on the whole planet. So he says, why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and wash away your sins. So Paul was baptized. He was now a member of the body of Christ. And he's not quite ready for his mission yet, but he's getting ready. Uh-huh. Oh, Mike. Mike, you don't have your mic.
So I like to also think about the fact that, as well as being incredibly intelligent, he picked a man who was suited to present the plan that God had throughout the ages. A plan that involved a knowledge of the past that pointed to this very moment in time that the Christ would come, live and die and be resurrected from the dead, and the gospel would go out into the world. And the cutting edge of that plan, which was the fact that Paul preached the gospel to the Gentiles, something that was inconceivable to the Gentiles and the Jews alike. But he was the man perfectly suited for it, trained in the ways of the Jews, trained in the ways of the Greeks thought, and you can see that by his epistles that he's written. And so not only did God look ahead, just 30 years, but I think even a greater spectrum of time than that, and ultimately also guided the circumstances of Saul's life so that he was that man.
Absolutely. By the way, he preached to the Jews every chance he got, too. And I was going to say something, and now I forgot. Oh, yeah, I remember. Boy, if I lose my mind, you guys, give it back to me if you find it. It's interesting to me, and this is a little side note, but Paul went to the school of Gamaliel, and I've said it before, that's like sending your child to Stanford or Yale or Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge. Those are world-class universities, and the school of Gamaliel would have been a world-class university. And Paul was taught not only in all the ways of the Jews, but also in the ways of the Gentiles. Remember, he quotes Greek poets. But something didn't click. I mean, as we read the scriptures, and we go all the way back to Genesis 12:3, when God said, through you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Boy, the Jews just didn't get that. By and large, they didn't get it. I think in chapter 5 of Acts it says, and a lot of priests became believers because they understood that Jesus was the Christ. But Paul had that same information, and he was taught that same information. He knew the Old Testament prophets. He knew Isaiah. He knew Micah. He knew all of those. And yet he didn't make the connection that Jesus was the Christ. He fulfilled all these things about himself, his crucifixion, his resurrection. Paul knew about those things, but he saw it rather than a fulfillment, which Jesus said Christianity was. Christianity is a fulfillment of the law. Jesus said, think not I come to destroy the law. I didn't come to destroy it. I came to fulfill it. He did not get that. Now he's got it. Andy, Bill. We have to be patient with Bill. He's old and slow.
I'm really amazed and impressed by Paul's humility here also, because in the world often the smarter you think you are or the more educated you are, the more, in many ways, closed-minded you become. You become difficult to learn new things, difficult to teach because you already think you know everything. And yet here's Paul, and when he has this face to face, he doesn't argue with God. He doesn't try to justify. He doesn't do any of that. And when you look at the history of the Old Testament and all the prophets and all the people in there, how many of them argued with God? How many of them bickered? How many of them tried to reason with God, try to justify? Paul didn't do any of that stuff. He just said, he showed repentance and humility, but he just said, what should I do? How do I fix this? How do I correct this?
Yeah. If we go back to chapter 9, we realize that Paul was blind for 3 days. It took him 3 days for it to sink into his head that he just spoke to the creator of the universe. I think I would have got it the first time I saw the lights and heard the voice, but it took Paul 3 days. So there was some adjusting in his mind that he had to come to the realization that Jesus is all that was promised in the Old Testament. There's not a prophecy in the Old Testament that hasn't been fulfilled about Jesus. 355, I think, something like that. So now he's baptized. Anna's told him, get up and wash away your sins. And the only way to do that is through baptism. You can't just say, I believe in you, that's good enough. It's not good enough. It wasn't good enough for Paul. Here's an example of a guy who is a world-class sinner, and he's being baptized. For what? He says, now why do you be up and wash away your sins? So what happened that when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple, and I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, now remember, Ananias told him, you're going to get a message from Jesus. This is that message. And it happened that when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. Even though even though Paul had this story to tell, and let's face it, not everybody runs across a bright light and blinds them and hears a voice out of heaven. Hadn't happened to me. And yet the Jews were so hard-hearted, or hard-headed, or both, they would not listen to what Paul had to say, even though he was just a few days ago one of their heroes. But something has happened to him, and they don't want to hear it. They don't want to have anything to do with it, which shows you how utterly hard-hearted they were and how they missed. Listen, these guys are not buffoons. They're intelligent men. But they missed the fact that when the Messiah came, he would be a king, but he wouldn't be a worldly king. They wanted somebody to kick the Romans out of Israel and give them back their freedom. Instead, they got a spiritual kingdom. That's not what they wanted. We don't need that. We want our freedom. We want these Romans to go away. And so they wouldn't listen to Paul, even if no matter what he did. They performed miracles and they didn't believe it. Talk about stuck on stupid. And I know. How did I do this? Why can't this happen to Spawn? So it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony. Because they were hard-hearted. And side note, this is sad. This is sad. Here are some people who were academically ahead of the rest of the nations around them. These guys were brilliant. They made a sewer and they 1,500 feet long, 1,500 yards long, and they started at both ends and they met in the middle exactly. They were intelligent people. They copied the scriptures perfectly. And if they made a mistake, they threw it away and started over. Their architecture was something special. And yet, they didn't want the very thing that God wanted for them. And they were just hard-hearted about it. Isn't that sad? That's sad. So, they're not going to believe your testimony. Get out of Jerusalem. And of course, we read about that over in 9 and 10, that he left and went up to Antioch. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. Surely they'd listen to me. I mean, after all, I was a hero, right? I killed them. I beat them. I arrested them. They're not going to believe you. And when the blood of your witness, Stephen, was being shed, I also was standing by approving. It says he was a young man. Young usually means someone under 30. But he would have seen and witnessed Stephen being stoned, and being stoned because he stood up for Christ. I was also standing by approving. Hearty approval. Way to go. And watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So Paul became the apostle to the Gentiles. It started off in Antioch. He went all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And he was 3 years. I don't know that it was 3 complete years, but he had gone off into Arabia, and I think that's where he learned a proper understanding of the gospel and a proper understanding of the prophecies concerning Jesus, which apparently he didn't get in the beginning. Smart as he was, I don't think he got it. I was on a roll, Bill. Go ahead.
But remember, whenever he spoke, like at this time here, he was given at that moment the things that he needed to speak. Mm-hmm. We hear that. So he didn't really, he needed to understand what he maybe didn't already understand. It took maybe some time to do that. But when he would represent the Lord, he was inspired directly to say the
absolutely.
thing. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, the studying part, we need to study because we're not inspired directly when we say things.
And
like
you're not
inspired, are you, Bill?
No.
But Paul was, and the other prophets were given what they were to speak at that very moment. So
no, it's my understanding that the 3 years, I don't think he spent it all in Arabia, but he must have spent enough time to get it straight in his mind about what the gospel was and what God's purpose for him was. And then he went to Antioch and taught those folks. But he was going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. In his first missionary journey, he had gone up into Galatia. They used to call that Galatians. He went up into Galatia. And on his second, then he went into Europe. He went all the way up to Macedonia, to Philippi, and those cities. And ditto his third missionary journey, same thing. He took the gospel to the Gentiles who received it better than the Jews did. Everywhere Paul went that had a synagogue, he went in it and spoke to them. And he reasoned with them. They didn't reason back too well. They just rejected what he had to say. But the Gentiles, on the other hand, saw the gospel, and now compare Gentiles with their religion, which was paganism. They saw the gospel as like a refreshing shower. I've used that expression before, just like a refreshing shower. Because paganism had its own drawbacks, lots of them. And it says, now these Jews, when he had held up his hands and he started speaking to them in Hebrew, they listened to him up to that point. That point being, and he said, go, for I will send you away to the Gentiles. Anybody want to tell me what the Jews' attitude toward Gentiles was? Anybody? They hated them. Josephus says in one of his statements, and don't ask me where it is, I'd have to go read the whole thing again to make a mark. But there were Jews that wouldn't even tell a Gentile where he could get a drink of water. Now think about that. Wouldn't you tell someone where they could at least get a drink of water? Of course you would. The Jews wouldn't. They hated the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, for the most part, hated them. But it says they listened to him up to this point. He had their ear. He told them about his former life. Now he's telling them about his current religious position. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. Get this guy out of here, take him out beyond the gates, and kill him. He is not worthy of life. And as they were crying out and throwing off their coats and throwing dust up in the air, which was one of their signs to say they're disgusted with this, into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks. Because, see, he could be safe in the barracks until he could find out what was going on. And he doesn't handle this as well as he could. It says the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging. Well, now that'll certainly get the job done, won't it? So that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. So if we scourge him, we'll certainly get the truth. I might not wait for the binding and all that. I might just blurt it out.
He was brought into the barracks to be safely scourged.
Yeah, safely scourged. Yeah. And it's kind of funny because and we're going to run across this when Tertullian speaks, but his version is, though the Jews were handling him with kid gloves. In a pig's eye, they were trying to kill him. And Claudius saved his life. And he took him back into the barracks to keep him safe. So he could be, as you said, safely scourged. I like that. So he should be examined by scourging so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. But when they stretched him out on the thongs, and a scourging post is about this high, and they lean you over like this, so it opens your back up, and you can get a real good shot at them that way. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said, "Wait a minute, just wait a minute. Not so fast, not so fast." But Paul said to the centurion, who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" Oops. A big oops. Oh no, what have I done? What have we done? I made a note about that. Let me read to you what I wrote. It was unlawful for a Roman citizen to be scourged, and if that happened, the person who did the scourging would be put to death. Roman law forbids the binding or beating of a Roman citizen. However, this did not stop Roman officials from abusing this law. Paul also had no trial. He wasn't convicted of anything. So the Romans and the commander trying to get to the bottom of this, and in his mind, he had a Roman sense of justice, not a godly sense of justice, said, well, we'll just scourge him. He'll tell us what we want to know. Not asking the question, are you a Roman citizen? This is serious business. A Roman official or a Roman commander like Claudius who would scourge someone for no reason at all, or reason, like he said, I just want to get the truth, who was a Roman citizen and uncondemned, that would cost him his life. That's how serious this is. So when Paul says, you wouldn't scourge a Roman citizen, would you? They go, oh no, what have we done? Oh my. This was serious. So Paul tells them, I'm a Roman citizen, and you're going to scourge me? Now, it's interesting because this time he spoke before he got beat. In Philippi, he got beat and then spoke. So things changed just a little bit. When the centurion heard this, now a centurion doesn't outrank the commander, but he went to the commander, he went to Claudius and told him saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. His heart must have just melted. Oh, what have I done? And the commander came in and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? Mm-hmm, I surely am. And his heart must have melted some more. Oh no, I've almost done something that might cost me my life. And the commander answered and said, I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money. So Claudius bought his citizenship. Paul was born into his. He was born in a Roman colony. His family were Romans. He was a Roman. But Claudius had purchased his citizenship with a large sum of money. But, go ahead.
Well, the significance of what they just exchanged information about was that there were several classes of Roman citizens, and those that were freeborn, as Paul was, had a higher claim to Roman citizenship than those who bought it. Unlike this country, where if you become an American citizen, everything's equal on that plane. But in that time, the commander recognized that Paul was even a Roman citizen of a higher order than he was.
Yeah,
because Paul's being born a Roman citizen qualified him to serve in certain higher offices that someone who purchased their citizenship could not have served in, and that was in Roman law.
I didn't know that exactly. I didn't know it exactly that way. Bill?
Yeah, it may have been too that these other people who were with the commander were not natural born or weren't Roman citizens at all, so they would even probably be more afraid. Just that they could have been from other nations that were brought into the Roman army and served that way or into their forces. So they could also have been, without Roman citizenship and would have been real. But it doesn't really matter if they were, I guess, because you still not supposed to beat somebody who's a Roman citizen. So.
Yeah, it's my understanding that if you're a Roman citizen, no matter what your status, you weren't to be scourged.
That's correct.
There were 3 ways that you could become a Roman citizen. You could be like Paul and be born into it. Like, I'm an American because I was born here. I'm a Washingtonian because I was born here. Or you could buy your citizenship like Claudius did. Or you could be awarded citizenship for doing some great act on behalf of the Roman Empire.
Or military service.
Well, same thing, yeah, military service.
I'm wondering, what about
Hold on.
What about marriage? Would that be another way to become if you married a Roman spouse?
I'm not sure that. I doubt it.
I know that works today, but I didn't know if that was the history back then, if that was another way.
Yeah, I'm not sure of that, but I don't think so, because women were like third-class citizens to start off with. They really were. They had no authority at all, or very, very, very little. But Paul says, I was actually born a citizen. I got one up on you. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let him go. They couldn't get them leather straps off him fast enough. And the commander was also afraid when he found out he was a Roman, because he had put chains on him. It was a serious offense to bind a Roman citizen, to scourge him. And if the governor had found out about that, in all likelihood, he would have lost his life. So to say that they were scared is probably an understatement. They were terrified that, oh, what have we done? Let's see. But on the next day, now Paul had been there 12 days. He'd been in Jerusalem, I believe, 12 days. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So we're talking about the council, we're talking about the Sanhedrin. So he let Paul go, took him down to the Sanhedrin, and now they can examine him. And that's where this chapter ends. With Paul in front of the Sanhedrin. Of course, they were good and honest men, weren't they? Full of good works. Not so. And yet, and I know we're almost out of time, we're also out of scriptures because I forgot to put another one in here. He's going to stand before them, and he's going to address them with great dignity and honor. And he's going to tell them his story, not the story that they're going to tell. So that's where this ends, and we're a few minutes out of time. Let me see. We might as well read the next part of the next one. Chapter 23. From here on, by the way, from the time that Paul was taken captive by the Romans in the temple or outside the temple, and then taken to the barracks, he was never a free man after that, not ever. And yet, he continued to be that light set on a hill. Look how many people he influenced. Even the Praetorian Guard when they took him to Rome, and Caesar's household. But starting in verse 23, I tell you what, we'll read the first paragraph, and then we'll go over it again next week. It says, Paul, looking intently at the council. That means he was very intense, serious, and said, brethren. So again, he addresses them as brethren. So he gets their ear, just like Stephen did. I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God to this day. He had put people to death, and yet he says, I did this with a good conscience. There were Nazis, boatloads of Nazis, who thought that by killing Jews, by ridding the world of this vermin, as they said, we've done the world a great service. We should get a gold star. They got a hanging instead. Paul says, I've done this with a good conscience. I thought I was working for God. And the high priest Annas came and commanded those standing by him to strike him on the mouth. Again, if that's Bill Downey there, he may feel a left hook. Instead, Paul says, you struck me. What did he call him? You whitewashed wall? Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Did God strike him? Everybody go like this. Yes, just read the destruction of Jerusalem. And I see we're out of time now. So let's start here next week, chapter 23. And these chapters will go pretty fast because we're only talking about history now. There's very little doctrine. There's just the conduct of Paul and how he handled himself and how he handled himself in front of Festus and Felix and Agrippa, handled himself as a godly man. Okay, till next week. Thank you for your kind attention, and may God bless each and every one of you.